Well, hi there, Strata Loungers. It's Bill Whittle, your host of the Stratosphere Lounge, here for episode number 80. 80 shows. 80 shows of, I was going to say awesomeness, but that's really not up to me. That's actually up to other people. However, as I said, somebody did put together sort of the master list of like everything, and I think it's 200 hours of something or other. So I'm going to see if I can get that listed and online so that everybody can has it. I think it's cross-reference. I think it's kind of a, an Excel file. You just find out what you want to hear talked about, and bango, there you get the episode and the time code and stuff. They did so much work. I was so grateful. I found out about that when I was in Dallas. So I'll see if we can catch up on that. How's everybody doing out there? We had a great show last week. We'll continue with those questions because it was fun. And I suspect we're probably going to have to go into a part 3. And as you can see, the background's still not finished. However, we do have good news there. We found a handyman because I was trying to get as much done as I possibly could. Sent him a couple pictures of the Stratosphere Lounge, and he's the old Stratosphere Lounge with the backlit pictures. He said, I want to work on something like this. So we're excited. Hopefully we'll get him in here tomorrow and get started over the weekend. The banners are up and everything, so I know I keep saying hopefully next week. I got to tell you, this hopefully next week thing is just so tormenting because every time I think is something going to happen next week, it's like I got more coal to shovel. I'm either on the road or, these once-a-week firewalls are really hard. They're tough to write, and the post-production is 2 days because they really look just, the new firewalls are just so snappy, and I love them. Anyway, we're actually trying to get there, bringing on a few more people, see if we can't get this ball moved down the road. But other than that, things are good. So, as you remember from, as you may recall from last week's episode, Dick Tufeld, by the way, died a little while ago, a year or two ago. Dick Tufeld was the voice of the robot in 2000. I'm sorry, in Lost in Space. We're gonna have Lost in Space stuff on that wall back there. I just noticed, by the way, I don't know if you're getting it, but on Ustream, I now have a choice that says ad begins in 2 minutes and 48 seconds, or you can watch it right now. Actually, kind of tempting to just put in boring ad spaces. By the way, something else that's interesting too about this, I'm going to look into, because there is a way for me to pay, as I mentioned before, for me to eliminate the ads on this end. But the problem is it costs money, and that's not so much a big deal. But the problem is they have, like, if you go over, there's these gigantic fees. And what I'm really trying to do is see if I can get a regular, realistic estimate of how many people are watching in real time. If I can put it together that way, then we'd just pay it so that the people watching live don't get penalized. And the ads don't appear in the YouTube version, which is where most people watch the show. So there's that as well. So I'll see if we can take a look at that. But in any event, we are on episode 80 of this fun little ride. And this will be part 2 of the tough questions liberals ask you kind of thing. I had so much fun with it last week because these things are not really that tough. I'm really kind of going more for substantive answers rather than snappy, quick little answers, although I try to throw some of those in there too. And because we have so many, and because I'm relatively time limited tonight, I got to be out about 7:45 here. It's 6:15 now, so hour and a half. We'll get through as many as we can, and if we have to pick up a third show, we will, and if we have to pick up a fourth show, we will, because it's a great topic. Just really terrific. And I think last time we left off with why is it that capitalism is moral if it means someone has more than someone else? And it's like we did that whole thing about you shouldn't be worried about what somebody else has that you don't have. You should be worried about whether or not you're doing better than you were before. If you can get to a place where you're looking at your benefits and your standard of living and all that other stuff, capitalism wins every time. And that's why what other people do is really none of your business, honestly. If they're making more money than you, you probably ought to ask why they're making more money than you. If they're making less money than you, you're welcome to make less money yourself. You just don't get to take other people's money who's working hard. It's just that simple. As Churchill said, capitalism is the unequal distribution of wealth, and socialism is the equal distribution of misery. So by any measure, Every individual does better in a capitalist free market society. And just think about what would happen if we had an actual free market instead of this mercantilism stuff. I'll do a quick aside just to connect us to last week's episode. Sometimes I'm bleeding edge, sometimes I'm cutting edge, and sometimes I'm late to the game. But one thing I was pretty late to the game on, at least relatively speaking, is Uber. But I took my first Uber experience in Phoenix, just in for the night a week ago. And I have to tell you, Uber is just the best thing I've ever experienced in terms of a game changer. It was incredibly fast, incredibly easy. I didn't have to. Not only could I not pay the guy, I'm not allowed to pay the guy. I got a credit card on file with them. As long as I've got my phone, I can get home. If my car breaks down, I don't have to worry about cab fare. It's there. And if I want to go out someplace and have a drink, that's great. If I want to have 2 drinks, then I can use the little, I have a little portable breathalyzer in my car. It's just kind of cool. The problem with having a couple of drinks is you don't know whether you've had too many or not. It's a little tough sometimes to tell. So I basically have a little portable breathalyzer in my car. It's $30. I love it. That's great. And if it turns out I'm a little over the limit, then I can just pop out my phone, pop that app up. I get driven directly to my door, and everything's great. And if I know I'm going to go out and have a good time, like I did at Phoenix, I'll just have Uber pick me up. My entire point is Uber is freedom, and Uber is it's just great. It's a private company. For those of you that haven't heard of it, I see 1 or 2 people in the comment section saying haven't heard of it. Uber's basically an app that basically lets your phone tell drivers who are registered with this company called Uber. It's a taxi service, basically. It's a private taxi service. Just think of it that way. And so I hit my app, and Uber knows where I am, and I request a pickup here or at another location, and I type in where I want to go. And Uber says your car will be there in 3 minutes, and it shows me a picture of the driver's face, and they have my credit card information on file, and they take me wherever I want to go. I've done 3 rides with them in absolute comfort. I've known people who use nothing but Uber. I don't exchange any money with them. The driver doesn't carry any money, and the fare is about 1/3 of what it would be on a cab. So I'm digging the Uber very, very much. Some people say there's a little bit of problems. Some people say there's a bit of safety issues. I don't know if that's true or not. I suppose like with anything else, there's safety issues with cabs too. But when you think of the number of people who aren't driving home drunk, Uber is nothing but a net win. I'm going to recycle the window on my feedback thing because it went to commercial and I just see a spinning wheel there. So let's do that. Hopefully it won't crash everything. It's not the broadcast window. It's my playback window. In any event, I took my first Uber ride and I loved it. And the reason I was got a little off the rails there was because Uber is freedom. Uber is actual free market capitalism. It's not mercantilism. And the reason I brought up Uber is because we are seeing in front of our eyes what we're calling our free market system destroy the actual free market. No one makes you get an Uber. No one forces you to get an Uber. But Uber is so effective and so efficient, works so well, that every cab company in America is trying to shut it down, and they are lobbying their representatives to get it to shut it down because it's cleaning their clocks. It's everything we believe in. It's free enterprise, it's private, it's voluntary. The people who are drivers for Uber are just reasonable, responsible people with decent cars. You get a chance to get in a car and go, and if you don't want to use it, you don't have to. But they're doing such a great job that it is putting cab businesses out of business because they're doing it for 1/3 the cost. And so all across the country, these limousine companies and these cab businesses are calling for legislation to ban something only because it's doing a better job of their job than they are. And that's the only reason they want it banned, is because it's cleaning their clocks. It's supposed to clean their clocks. It's how it's supposed to work. So when we talk about our capitalism system being better than socialism, just think about what capitalism would be like if it were an actual, honest-to-God, free market economy where there were no business subsidies for anyone, anywhere, anytime, and big business didn't have the power to use laws to keep little businesses out of the marketplace. In other words, get the mercantilism out of capitalism and watch what happens, guys. Watch what happens. Uber is just a perfect example playing out in real time of a system that's using third wave information age technology, using the cell phone to provide a much better, much faster, much cheaper service, and therefore must be destroyed by the mercantile-loving crony capitalists who talk about a free market, but basically will do anything they can to legally keep people out of competition with them because they know they can't compete with this. So you see it all over the place, everywhere. So anyway, so much for the end of that last question. So we'll start off with the next one, which comes from Joshua Lazoya, who says, how can you say that global warming doesn't exist when most scientists say that it does? I'm not denying that global warming exists. I'm not denying that global cooling exists. The climate has been warming and cooling all the time. The climate is in a perpetual state of motion. They lost the argument when they stopped calling it man-made global warming and started referring to it as climate change. And the reason they lost the argument that instant is because the climate has been changing since the Earth has been here. If you look at the history of the Earth's temperatures going all the way back to the existence of the Earth, using whatever methods they're able to use to determine how temperatures were, use biomass temperature measurements and calcium, all this stuff, ice cores, all this jazz, you find that the Earth has been in a state of constant flux. The temperature of the Earth has been changing constantly. So the second that they stop saying man-made global warming and start saying climate change, it's over. They lost. Because man-made global warming is a once-in-history crisis and catastrophe that deserves to be dealt with, but global climate change is like saying we've got to stop your breathing. You're like, stop the planet breathing. That's like trying to say we've got to stop the waves. The climate has been changing in the Earth since there's been an Earth. So when they say we've got to do something about climate change, think about what that says. If it gets warmer, they'll take all your money and your freedom. If it gets colder, they'll take all your money and your freedom. Any change, if a storm comes up and say, look at this terrible storm, even though storms are considerably less powerful than they were just a few years ago, then they'll bring that out too. We're decreasing the power of storms. Storms are getting weaker. Hurricanes are getting weaker. And that's not putting enough water into the ecosystem. We have to rapidly do something to increase the strength of hurricanes. And mark my words, they're going to tell you this happened. When they say climate change, they lose on their face. It doesn't help them any to show that the period of steep warming that alarmed them. And look, let's just be fair here, okay? If you look at if you're living in 1998, 1999, right in there, that's when the warming stopped, and you see this steep increase in warming, I would want a scientist to say this is unusual. What's causing this? That's fine. And I wouldn't mind a scientist who says, we're very concerned if this trend continues in the future. That's fine too. But when they've got everything invested in this, and then in 1998, the warming just stops, and now we have 17 years of no warming at all, when the data that caused them to run around with their hair on fire in the first place now shows no more warming, although carbon dioxide levels continue not only to increase but to accelerate, that invalidates their theory. And if they were real scientists, they'd say they made a mistake and they'd go home and try and figure out what the real cause is. Because if global warming is caused by CO2, man-made CO2 has not only been slowing down, it's been increasing. Global temperatures right around 98, 2000 have flatlined, and now the Arctic, which we were told would be ice-free this year by Al Gore 10 years ago, is in fact showing more ice, 40% more dense ice, than it did 2 years ago. An area twice the size of Alaska, and Alaska is not tiny, ladies and gentlemen, is now under ice when it wasn't under ice 2 years ago. This is evidence that the theory is incorrect. And they won't accept that. And they won't accept the fact that when they talk about thousands of science, to get a little more into your question, Joshua, when most scientists say that it does, when they say most scientists say that global warming is happening, as I said, climate change is a ridiculous argument. When you say most scientists, and they'll say thousands of scientists, well, thousands of scientists are using data provided by two sets of scientists. Virtually all climate data is derived from temperature records kept and maintained by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, that's NOAA, and by East Anglia University in Britain. So all of the data sets that the thousands and thousands of people work on are controlled by two labs, basically. Both of these labs have long trails of email evidence indicating that the data sets have been faked, and that every single time an adjustment has been made. And when I say an adjustment, I say, let's say that a temperature sensor in Bolivia is reading 93 degrees Fahrenheit, and they adjust it to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And they claim they need the adjustment because, well, urban areas or because of new changes in methodology, blah, 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 blah. They keep doing these adjustments. Every single adjustment, every single one of them has been to raise temperatures. And as my friend Bert Rutan says, there's little details like when the Soviet Union disappeared in the late 1980s, early 1990s, something like 1,500 temperature sensors went offline in Siberia because they didn't have the means to pay for them anymore. So what do you think happens to average global temperatures if you pull 1,500 sensors data out of the Arctic and you don't compensate for that? What do you think that would do? We've got all these sensors over here that are showing cold, 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 cold. Oops, they're gone. Look at that incredible climb in global temperatures. What possibly could have caused it? We know what caused it. As I said before, Bert Rutan has gotten to be a great friend of mine, and Bert is a guy he's a once in a lifetime out of the box genius. And Bert's job is analyzing data. Bert's an engineer. Bert deals with data. He gets flight data from flight test instruments. He has a pretty good idea of how these vehicles are going to perform before he launches them. But Bert doesn't sit down on a piece of paper, sketch out an airplane, build the airplane, and hope everything goes well. Bert sits down with a piece of paper, sketches an airplane based on what he knows about his background in aerodynamics. So far, so good. So far, we're with the climate people. And he has computer models that will determine various stresses and loads, and so far, we're still with the climate people. Then Bert builds a test airplane and goes out and gets data from the real world. And when the real world contradicts his model, Bert Rutan doesn't say, the real world must be wrong. Because if Bert had that kind of arrogance, if he had the kind of arrogance that these climatologists had, his friends would be dead. His friends would die. And I mean his close friends. And his business would fail. Because he would go out and try to build an airplane based on what he thought the data was going to say, and the data came back and said, no, it's something different. And Bert's not arrogant enough to say, in a conflict between Bert Rutan's calculations and the forces of nature must be incorrect. And that is what the climate scientists are saying. The computer models don't match the observed reality, therefore the atmosphere must be wrong. That's basically what they say. You know, I was listening to the BBC talk about this, just happened to catch it the other day. Once again, this is like 2 days ago, and the guy was going, we're almost out of time. We're almost out of time. Carbon dioxide levels are expanding even more rapidly than they were before. And I actually smiled this time. Actually, you know, this sounds kind of like, you know, you're kind of selling me Kiana shirts here and wide collars, and you're kind of talking about the incredible triple knit polyester. It's old and tired, and it just doesn't even sound believable even to us anymore. But listening to the French scientist, and it's a brand new organization, by the way, it's the Institute of Meteorology, International Institute of Meteorology, or something like this. And you're listening to this guy, and he's saying carbon dioxide levels have actually increased at a faster rate. It's kind of a shame that the Arctic is more densely packed with ice than it was. That's a little disconcerting for him. But, of course, they didn't mention that on the show. They talk about what can we do now? What can governments do now? Should they just step in and ban entire industries? That's what the BBC wanted because they're fascists. But what the guy said, he had a couple things that were just interesting things to say. He would say, for example, that the French guy saying, and carbon dioxide lasts quite a long time as a pollutant. You know, he says some of it's absorbed by the oceans and some of it's absorbed by the biomass. But he said it can take up to 100 or 200 years for the carbon dioxide to be absorbed by the atmosphere. And I thought that a ridiculous thing to say. Because the atmosphere is made up of carbon dioxide. It take 200 years for the carbon dioxide to disappear? Disappear where? Into the atmosphere? Well, the atmosphere is made of carbon dioxide. I mean, it's hydrogen, helium, methane. It's nitrogen, obviously nitrogen. I was going with Jupiter. Nitrogen, oxygen, inert gases, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and carbon dioxide's not much. I think it's a percentage. 1 or 2% of our total atmosphere is carbon dioxide. So it doesn't go anywhere. Even that is off the rails. Last thing I'll say about global warming is this. I mentioned Bert earlier because Bert has a beautiful saying. He was crunching the data from both NOAA and East Anglia, and he's got a very compelling 1-hour brief, which I'll try to boil down into a firewall or something. But it's very, very, very compelling. And he said he gave this, and a couple of people stood up and challenged him and said, well, Bert Rutan, you're an aeronautical engineer. You're not a climatologist. Where do you get your data from? What credentials do you have to present this data? And this is the killer, right? Bert turned to him and said, you don't understand. I'm not presenting alternate data that shows that your argument is mush. I'm showing you that your data shows that your argument is mush. I read data for a living. There's no signal here. That's what Bert Rutan says to them. He says, there is no signal here. I look at your data and telling you that based on your data, your argument's mush. So there you go. And when guys say I heard this on the BBC report too. It's like carbon dioxide levels have never been higher. That's a flat out lie. Flat out lie. Carbon dioxide levels have been 3 or 4 or 5 times higher than they are right now. When they say they've never been higher, what he means is maybe they've never been higher in the industrial age. But they have not been like 20% higher or 50% higher. They are 300% higher than they are right now. And there's no model or any indication that they're ever going to get to those levels ever. So in order to kind of break this down for you, Joshua, about the global warming thing, you've actually got about 6 different layers. You got about 6 different trenches that you can fight from on this one. First of all, the first trench you can fight from is there is no longer any global warming. Temperatures have been flat longer now than they were during the spurt that caused this thing in the first place. And once they say global climate change instead of global warming, it means that there is not a trend that they're worried about. It literally means that any data, anywhere, anytime can make their case, so you can fight in that trench. The second trench you can fight in is the idea that all of these data sets have been faked, that there's evidence, email evidence, saying they've been faked, that the people who are the big champions for shut down everything because the world's coming to an end say openly, we cannot let this data get out because if it does, it will discredit our argument, and so on. They didn't say, they didn't even say we can't let them do experiments. They said this existing data cannot be revealed because if it does, it will discredit our argument. That's not science, and that's not a scientist. Scientists don't work that way. So there's that argument. You've got thousands of scientists, and they're all working from 2 data sets. And both of the data sets have internal memos, not criticism launched at them by somebody else, internal acknowledgments that not only is their data screwy, but that every single time the data is screwy, it's because the data is lower than they predicted. Therefore, they have to lie and make it higher to match their theory. These are people trying to make the world conform to a theory. That's why they're formally socialists. That's why socialists have so much in common with environmentalists. It's not whether it's true or not. It's they want it to be true. And if they can't get the data to match what they want, then they'll invent the data. And if they can't cherry pick the data, they'll just simply forge it. So there's that argument. There's another argument that's, I think, a compelling argument. And the argument you can basically say is global warming is happening, the Earth's getting warmer, and carbon dioxide levels are rising. So what? So what? What do you mean, so what? So what? What? Show me where the harm is. Well, if the temperatures are warmer, 100,000 people more a year are going to die from heat stroke. How many people freeze to death in the winter? There's a guy called the skeptical climatologist, a Swedish guy, I think, a great guy. I met him. I forgot his name. It'll come up in a second in the comments streams here. But basically what he's saying is, if you take a look at the number of additional heat deaths forecast, it's something like 1/5 of the total number of cold deaths that will be prevented. In other words, a warming planet actually saves lives. Yes, some more people will die of heat stroke, but larger numbers of people won't freeze to death. But, of course, that doesn't measure into the account or anything. There was the same guy took a look at the number of polar bears that were dying each year, and as it turns out, it was something like, let's just say for the sake of the argument, it was 12 polar bears that were proven to have drowned because of melting ice. Turns out there's something like 60 polar bears that are killed every year by human hunting. If you want to save the polar bears, no one's arguing there's going to be 60 of them killed a year by human hunting. So again, it's this kind of thing, right? It just falls apart. But so what if it's getting warmer? Here's a really interesting thing to say to somebody, If you were to stand in Kansas, the state of Kansas right now, 10, 12,000 years ago, you wouldn't be able to stand on the ground in the state of Kansas because 12,000 years ago, Kansas was under about a mile of ice. It was much colder then. CO2 levels were lower. But if you go back further than that, I forget the number, it's about, Bjorn Lomborg, thank you, Brendan. Go back 100 million years ago, the center of this country, including Kansas, was not just under a mile of ice, it was under 200, 300 feet of water. And Kansas was paradise. Kansas had on the shores brontosauruses, or brachiosauruses, I suppose I should say, and there were pterodactyls flying through the air, and there were plesiosaurs swimming through the waters, and there were thousands of different species of fish, and all of this life, and there were ferns, and there were palm trees, and there were all of this biosphere, and it was paradise. In the middle of Kansas, when global CO2 levels were twice what they are now, and sea levels had risen so high that there was an inland sea in the middle of America. And if you're all about life forms and biodiversity, that's what you want for the middle of Kansas. If you go to the middle of Kansas today, it's a wasteland. It's a wasteland that's filled with grass. All the dinosaurs have gone, all the life forms have gone, all of the pterodactyls have gone, all the plesiosaurs have gone. It's all gone. And it's gone because of this horrifically low carbon dioxide levels that we have right now because the temperatures are so low. Make that case very easily. So which climate do you want to protect and why? You make that whole case, the whole faking case. And frankly, you can make the case that, look, there is a very small... You understand that everything that they're talking about comes out of computers, right? That carbon, and that not even they claim that it's the carbon dioxide that's going to cause the temperature increase. It's the increase in carbon dioxide that's going to force the temperature increase. Virtually all of the atmosphere's heat retention is done through water vapor. Water vapor is far, 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 far more effective greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So their argument is a little increase in carbon dioxide will lead to a little bit more evaporation, but that leads to more water vapor, and it's the water vapor that does most of the work. Forcing. How do they know what these numbers are? They plug it into a computer. And if reality disagrees with the computer, then the reality must be wrong. Have you noticed, by the way, that Al Gore made this mistake? But have you noticed that none of these guys are able to predict things in the reasonable short term? In other words, if you're predicting, let's just say you're predicting a 1 degree centigrade increase in 100 years. In 10 years, you should see a 1/10 of a degree increase. No one's making predictions that are measurable. Al Gore said that if we don't get to work on this by 2015, he said 10 years from now in 2005, it will be too late to stop it. Well, that's another 6 months. I think Rush Limbaugh, genius that he is, put up an Earth death clock. And in another 3 or 4 months, according to the guru of all of this, it'll be too late to stop it. It's too late. We just blew it. So might as well enjoy ourselves, get an SUV and have fun. And I think the final thing I'll say about this, if you really want to make an argument, is this. Al Gore is, rightly enough, I suppose, considered to be the high priest of the man-made global warming catastrophe to the Earth. He's the one that got all the attention in the Academy Awards. He's made hundreds of millions of dollars by offering papal dispensations in the form of carbon credits. And he's the guy that said, if we don't act now, the planet's going to die. And Al Gore is rightly associated with this movement. Now, here's a point that really needs some serious thinking about. Al Gore knows he's lying. And he knew he was lying the whole time. And how can I tell you this? I can tell you this because despite what you saw in An Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore standing there alone in the it's 2 o'clock in the morning and Al Gore's got the red eye or the morning flight on, back to spread this message. And you see him standing there alone with his suitcases or sitting there at 2 o'clock in the morning in the terminal at the airport, blah, 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 blah. Nonsense. He travels around in private jets. And up until it was shamed him into it, he might have made some changes since then, it was revealed that Al Gore's house in Tennessee, his mansion, had an electrical bill that was not 2 times the average electrical bill for somebody in Tennessee or 5 times or 10 times. His electrical bill was 30 times what the average Tennessean's electrical bill was. He was burning 30 times as much carbon as the next guy. Now let me just tell you why you know Al Gore's a liar. If I had a theory that eating grapes caused the extinction of the earth, and I believed it in my bones, I genuinely believed it, and I thought it was my mission to convince you that humans eating grapes was the reason the earth was going to die and that you could never eat another grape again, then, if I actually believed that, I can assure you that you would never see me eat a grape for the rest of my life. And you sure as hell wouldn't see me eating 30 times as many grapes as the guy sitting next to me at a restaurant, right? If I really believed it in my heart, I would make sure that my electric bill was 0, that my carbon footprint was 0. And I would, in fact, take trains to symposiums or whatever the lowest form of carbon footprint is. If I really believed it, I would act like I believed it, because I would know that all the... And people say, well, what difference was your personal consumption make? Well, my personal consumption is 1/300 of American consumption. But if I was the high priest of grape eating or prevention of grape eating, then my personal consumption levels are going to be examined by both my followers and my antagonists. And the fact that Al Gore was burning 30 times as much electricity using fossil fuels as the average Tennessean is evidence that he doesn't believe it. Because if he did believe it, he'd never allow that to happen. I'll be here all night with this one. But the last thing I'll close on, as I said in a couple speeches, and I think I'm probably going to do in this coming Afterburner, Firewall. I saw a documentary back in 2004 or so, and it was one of these things. You must watch this. Your children are going to die if you don't. The planet is in danger. We're all gonna croak. Global warming special from about 10 years ago, and it was hosted by a network executive, a network anchor man, one of the top guys, and it was on network news. It was an evening documentary, hour-long documentary about global warming, and it was a big deal, and they promoted the hell out of it. So I watched the first little bit of it. And let's just say it was Tom Brokaw. I don't remember who, but let's say it was Tom Brokaw. And he's standing in front of the Arctic Ocean, and he's looking at the camera very seriously. And he says, the last time that this ocean behind me here in the Arctic has been liquid, ice-free, in September was 20 million years ago. Global warming is real. It's happening, and we have to do something about it. And I thought to myself, if 20 million years ago the Arctic was unfrozen like it is now, whose SUVs and coal-fired plants caused it to be liquid 20 million years ago? Because that seems like a reasonable question to ask if you're telling me that it's gas-guzzling cars and coal fire plants that are causing this catastrophe. So, if it happened 20 million years ago, who caused it then? And apparently, these people can't even do that simple level of logic. They can't even put those two things together. And there's a second question that follows that, of course, and that is, if it turns out that this ice-free sea 20 million years ago this ice-free sea that we're looking at now is the sign of an irreversible climate disaster, how is it that 20 million years ago, the exact same conditions that you're saying are happening now that are going to kill the Earth, if it happened 20 million years ago, why are we still here? In other words, if the climate went through this kind of warming 20 million years ago and there weren't even humans around, then not only what caused it, but an even better question is, how do we recover? How do we recover? How did the Earth not die? Now you really get down to the brass tacks of the issue. Because the brass tacks of the issue are pretty simple, really. This is the thing you really absolutely have to understand about this entire argument, and that's this. The Earth is a negative feedback system, and if it wasn't, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Nobody would have been having this discussion. There wouldn't have been fossils to check or any of that stuff, because there wouldn't have been life on Earth. There's two different kinds of feedback. There's a steady state thing, right, where if you touch something, it stays in a steady state. But there's a kind of a positive feedback loop where if you make a change, it moves and then it accelerates, and the more you move it, the faster it goes out of whack. And then there's a negative feedback loop where if you push something one way, there are forces that bring it back to the middle. Positive feedback is if you push something one way, there are forces that make it go further. The best way to visualize this that I've ever heard is imagine a bowl, just a bowl, a curved bottom bowl. And if you put a bowl down on the ground with the curvy side up, and you put a marble on the top of the bowl, and you balance the marble very delicately, the marble will stay there. But if you add a little bit of impetus, like just blow on it just a little bit, just the slightest bit, that breath will move that marble off the center of the bowl, and because of positive feedback, that marble will accelerate and get faster and faster and faster till it falls off the bowl. That's positive feedback. And if the Earth were built that way, then the slightest bit of warming, as they say, the slightest bit of cooling, would have sent the Earth either into a crisp or into a frozen snowball from which we never would have recovered. However, if you take the bowl and turn it upside down, and you put the marble in the bottom of the bowl rather than on the top of the bowl, if you put the marble in the bottom of the bowl, now you have a negative feedback situation. So if you blow on the marble moves a little bit up the rim, but it comes right back down again. You can plink the marble, it'll move up the rim, it'll come back down again. The more you knock it, the further out it goes, and the faster it comes right back down again. And if the Earth wasn't constructed this way, if the Earth's atmosphere wasn't a negative feedback situation, we wouldn't have life on Earth. Because the first time that we had any kind of, forget humans, the first time there was an asteroid impact and all that dust went into the air and cooled the planet down, well, then the Earth would have turned into a frozen snowball, would have stayed a frozen snowball forever. The first time that volcanoes gassed enough carbon dioxide into the air to start the so-called runaway greenhouse effect, then we would have turned into Venus and we would have been fried to a crisp, and that would have happened billions of years ago. So there's obviously something that's at work that says that if the Earth starts to get warmer and warmer and warmer, it will do that to a point at which point things will happen that will bring the Earth back down to more of a centralized temperature. Likewise, if CO2 and temperatures get a little low, there's also a mechanism that warms it back up again. Most of it's got to do with albedo. Most of it's got to do with the fact that the colder the planet gets, it affects ice, it affects all kinds of other things, or affects reflectivity. But the Earth wants to be at a more or less mean temperature, and we're right in the middle of that more or less mean temperature right now. Earth's been hotter than it is. Earth's been colder than it is. There's been more carbon dioxide, less carbon dioxide. There's nothing here we haven't seen before. And so what do you say except no, do not want. There we go. Aloe Conson comes with a couple, a brace of great questions. He starts off with, why do you keep criticizing socialism when it's never been properly tried? Hear that a lot. There's a meme out there called Bad Guy Steve, and he's wearing this doofus hat. So anytime somebody says something bad, if you put a doofus, this doofusy kind of, I guess it's like a Louis Vuitton hat or something. Put a Louis Vuitton hat on anything, it's like bad guy so-and-so. And there's this picture of Stalin with a Louis Vuitton hat, and it was like bad guy Stalin, and it was basically said, gets blamed for socialism even though he wasn't a socialist. Or socialism gets blamed for Stalinism even though Stalin wasn't a socialist. The problem with this argument is Stalin thought he was a socialist. The communists are socialists. The Nazis were socialists. They weren't socialists. They were. They were racial socialists. They believed in everything that you socialists believe in today. The Nazis, forget the communists. We know the communists were socialists. They may not have thought, the Nazis may not have believed in community property, but they believed in a giant state that controlled the economy. They believed in an all-powerful leader. They believed in cradle-to-grave benefits. They believed in work programs. They believed in the absolute destruction of the individual for the glory of the state. They were in every way, with things like Hitler Youth and with all of these programs, they were as socialist as anybody else. They were social animals, and they called themselves National Socialists. So they were basically more national. They were racial socialists. The communists were international socialists. They named themselves. I didn't name them. So they basically, the argument that you hear from these liberal douches is, why do you criticize socialism when socialism has never been properly tried? And my response to you would be, well, if over 120 years it has been implemented in scores, if not hundreds of cases, and the end result has always been catastrophe, maybe it's never been properly tried because it's impossible. This is like saying, why don't you believe in levitation when levitation's never been properly tried? If I have 500 people over the course of 5 million years concentrating on flying and they don't fly, then the fact that they're not flying is not an indication of my impatience or lack of belief. What it is it's an indication that it ain't working. There's a lot of things that you'd like to be true that don't work, and this is one of them. Socialism's never been properly tried yet. Well, they tried it in the home of communism, which was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and it resulted in the murder by starvation of 10 million, 20 million kulaks, the execution in the basement of a building in downtown Moscow of 800,000 people. Murder, murder, murder. If you don't believe in the glorious paradise that's coming, we'll kill you. And we'll kill each other, too. And when we kill each other, when we execute our comrades, because all of Lenin's comrades were killed, all the old Bolsheviks were killed by Stalin. They were just shot in the back of the head. They didn't shoot just people who were opposed to communism. They shot the authors of communism. And they shot all of the guys who did the shooting. So if you were the chief of police, let's say you were Yagoda, you murdered as many millions of people as you could for Stalin, and then you got to know too much, so you're murdered by Yezhov. And then when you're Yezhov, you get down to business and you start murdering people by the millions every night. You're down in the basement of Lubyanka shooting 5,000-6,000 people in the back of the head per night. And after you've murdered enough people, then you are murdered by Beria. And after Beria gets to work for 25 or 30 or 40 years, actually survives Stalin, when it's time for you to take over the government, you're murdered too. Keep killing until paradise arrives. If you want a motto for socialism, that's pretty much it. Keep killing until the paradise arrives. And it ain't never arrived. And it's not because it wasn't done right, you miserable low-life apologist for murder. It didn't happen because your philosophy is predicated on murder. And if you kill the successful people, then you are going to have an unsuccessful society. Do you know that during the years of the Soviet Union prior to the war, when they were trying to purge all of the people who were preventing the glorious socialist future, they were looking for people, and they had a term for them. And the term was wreckers, and wrecking was an art form. Why has the glorious Soviet plan for our railroad industry continued to fall so short? Must be because of the sabotage of those smart people who used to make a lot of money. The wreckers have sabotaged the lines, the train lines. When I say wreckers, I mean, engineers, dispatchers. So obviously, since the trains are not running the way they should be running, the solution is kill the engineers, because they're obviously wrecking our predetermined, utterly pie in the sky totals. And since we're not achieving them, it can't be the fault of our political system, because socialism is glorious. So it must be somebody sabotaging, so kill them. So if you kill all the inspectors and all the engineers and all the conductors and all of the switchers and all of the capable people, what do you think happens to railway productivity and to railway safety? It goes down. And if it goes down in the midst of all of these efforts to purge the wreckers, then that certainly means that there must be more wreckers. And those people have to be killed too. And those of you we sent down earlier to purge the first wreckers, you didn't do a very good job since the lines are getting worse, not better. We're going to have to kill those people as well. And so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. And it's just a giant stream of murder is what it is. Because if you kill the competent people, things are going to get worse. Do you know, I'm pretty sure this was, I know for a certain fact it was within 1 year, and I think it might have been on one line in 1 year. Do you know how many railroad accidents there were, I think, on one line in 1 year? And it was like 1934, 1935 in the Soviet Union. You know how many train accidents there were in that 1 year? 65,000 of them. In 1 year, 65,000 train accidents. Because of the glories of socialism. Because you can't allow a railroad engineer to make more money than a guy who shovels coal into the engine. That wouldn't be fair. So the people who've spent a lifetime developing skills decided they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to work as hard, or they wanted to get out of here. They're murdered. And the people who have no skills take over their jobs, and everything goes to hell. And that's the wonderful world of socialism. Now, that's for communism, and they go out and they get killed. And P.J. O'Rourke said, all you need to know about socialism is you would have these Americans, these true believers, red diaper babies, these kind of, American leftists who, this would be as late as the 80s, according to P.J., 70s, 80s, maybe even, into the 80s. And he said every now and then there would be a tour of the Soviet Union organized specifically for American leftists, like our president and the rest of those clowns. And they would go over to see the wonders of the dam that was owned by the people and a bridge that was owned by the people. And PJ said they were advised on this tour of the Soviet Union to bring their own toilet paper with them from America. And PJ said, that's all you need to know about communism. Take a tour of their space launch facilities, but be sure to bring your own toilet paper. Perfect. PJ was talking about being on radio stations in Russia in the 80s. And he would look around, and I've used this expression 1,000 times. It took me a while to figure out where I got it from. I had to kind of go back and remember it. And he said you'd go into a building in Russia or something like that, somewhat technical. He said you look around. He said, look, everything, including the furniture, certainly the electronics, looked like it was built by apes. Looked like it was built by apes. And if you look at Russian airplanes to this day, even to this day, you get up close to an F-18 in America, and you may see a little bit of wear on it, a little bit of oil stains, but the thing looks like it's cut out of one piece of sapphire. You look at Soviet airplanes, they're bolted together and they're riveted together and the rivets don't match. It looks like it's falling apart. The whole society looked like it was built by apes because it was. They're built by alcoholics. And one of the reasons they're so drunk in the Soviet Union all the time is because why wouldn't you be drunk? You have nothing to look forward to. You work all you want, doesn't matter. You're not going to get any richer or poorer. The work you do is not going to be rewarded or even really criticized. As somebody just pointed out in the comment stream, the big running joke that was a 70-year running joke that caused the death of millions of people. But if you lived in the Soviet Union, in the socialist paradise, the workers' paradise on earth, the joke was, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. Perfect, right? People sitting around at their desk doing nothing, drinking vodka, waiting for paychecks that don't arrive. What else would you do if you lived in a land like that except get drunk? Try to escape. That's what you might do. And a lot of people died trying to do that. So we find that's what happened in Russia, and it's what happened in China, and it's what happened in Cambodia, and it's what happened in Cuba. Cuba used to be one of the richest countries in the Caribbean. Now it's dirt poor. Venezuela, which was taken over by Chavez and turned into a giant socialist camp, has one of the greatest oil deposits in the world, but they're importing oil now because their political philosophies have ruined everything of any consequence in that country. You can't escape this data. But let's have another look at it. Look, this is what happens when socialism is imposed virtually everywhere. Africa, by the way, Africa is one giant catastrophe. It's a disaster area the size of every other continent in the world put together, because Africa is one giant socialist nightmare that's just dependent on foreign aid and redistribution of ever-dwindling amounts of wealth. But let's go to the one argument that seems to get traction, because we're dealing with liberal arguments here. And this one took me a little while to figure out. So when we talk about socialism, we always talk about Russia, Cuba, China, these horrible nightmares where people are killed and there's a secret police and all that other stuff, or just the general failures of Africa and the rest of it. But what about Sweden? Sweden's a socialist state. Sweden has cradle-to-grave benefits, and so does neighboring Finland. And Sweden and Finland are routinely shown to be the happiest people in the world. So people will say, well, what about Sweden? Socialism works in Sweden, they'll say. But does it, is really the question. There are two things to say about Swedish socialism. And nobody seems to mention these things when we talk about, free health care. I had a guy, by the way, I've told the story probably once before. You want to talk about, I had no political thoughts until I was in my 40s. But I was about 30 years old, I guess, and I was driving a limousine here in L.A., and I don't think about these things at the time. I had other things to think about. And I was driving a Norwegian businessman to LAX in a town car. We were having a conversation about something. And he said, Bill, you seem like an intelligent American. What a kind thing to say. And he said, how is it that a smart guy like you doesn't believe in universal health care in Sweden? Norway, rather. He was from Norway. He said, I'm Norwegian. My health care is free. I could fall getting out of this car and break my leg, and if I did, I'd be rushed to the hospital. My health care would take care of it. I'd be given a helicopter ride to wherever I need, and then I'll be given my full salary for up to a year, and then 80% of my salary for the remaining 5 years or whatever. And if I'm incapacitated, I get almost all my salary, and all my housing is taken care of, all this other stuff. And he's saying, and all of it's free. How could you argue with that? And I didn't even turn around. I'm driving a car. And I said, do you mind if I ask you what you pay in taxes? And he said, it's about 78%. I said, so it's not free, sir, with respect. It's prepaid, right? It's not free. It's prepaid. You're paying for that helicopter ride to the hospital, whether you need it or not. It's coming out of your paycheck every single week. And you don't strike me as a man who's fallen down and broken your leg every single week. In other words, while your hospital trip and your helicopter ride and your benefits are being taken out of your paycheck every single week, you don't strike me as a guy who's ever once needed it. So who's really the intelligent person here? Because you continue to pay, and you've paid your entire life for something you've never used. And you're criticizing me and my society for having the temerity to say, we'd like to keep as much money as we can. We'll set aside what we need to if that happens, and the rest of it we're going to use to build our futures or a business or do something new. And he got a little quiet after that, because it's not free health care. It's prepaid health care. And everything in Sweden is prepaid. People work for it. But when people say Sweden works, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work for two reasons. And one of them's kind of obvious, and the other one is not so obvious. But you got to think about this, because I really think I'm onto something here. First of all, socialism in Sweden does not work because as a country becomes more socialist, they have fewer and fewer children. Now, that may sound terrific to progressives. The reason you have fewer children is because you don't need children. And children are expensive. And you don't need children to pay for your retirement. You don't need children to take care of you in your old age, because the state will do that. When you look at a socialist society like Sweden, you're looking at a birth rate of about 1.3. 1.3 children per couple means that you need 2 children per couple to hold the population stationary. You actually need 2.1 to make up for the Darwin people, right? So you need mom to reproduce one person for mom to reproduce a second person for dad, plus 1/10 of one person to make up for the people that get famous on the news by saying, hey, watch this. because they're not going to live long enough to reproduce. So 2.1 is sustainable birth rate. Anything above 2.1, your population's growing. Anything below that, it's falling. And if you look at Sweden, it's 1.6, 1.7, 1.5. Italy is like 1.3. Every year, that population gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So there are fewer and fewer and fewer workers to pay for more and more and more retired people, and it's going to collapse. And they know it's going to collapse. So what does Sweden do to avoid this collapse? They import large numbers of immigrants to come in at the bottom of the socialist pyramid and to work their way up. But unfortunately, since Swedes are so, this is a part I think needs to be made clear. There's something about socialism that destroys the life force in people. I met Swedes in Miami when I was out working in nightclubs, and they're beautiful, beautiful girls and good-looking men, and they just didn't give a damn. They didn't care about anything. They didn't care about sex. They didn't care about life. They didn't care about business. They didn't care about jobs. They had no goals. They had no ambitions. They were non-people. They had nothing. They just were moderately happy, relatively decent, not terribly friendly people who had nothing to look forward to at all. So it sucks the life force out of you, this cradle to grave benefit thing. But put that aside. So what's happening in Sweden? What's happening in Norway? They're bringing in more and more and more Muslim workers to pay for the ever smaller percentage of retiring racial Swedes, genetic Swedes, blonde, blue-eyed people. And as the number of Muslims come in at the bottom of that pyramid to keep this socialist scam going, because it is a Ponzi scheme, socialism, as this continues, Sweden and Norway become less and less Swedish and less Norwegian until finally it's not their country anymore. And it's not going to wait till the end. It's just going to collapse. Nobody likes to say this, and unfortunately it's true. But I heard the other day, actually it was about a year ago, come to think of it, anybody want to guess of all of the rapes committed in where was it? In Oslo. All of the rapes committed in Oslo. Anybody want to guess at the percentage of rapes in the last 5 years committed in Oslo? What percentage were committed by Muslim guest workers or Muslim immigrants? Of the total rapes in Oslo over the last 5 years, what percentage was committed by these Muslim immigrants? It's 100%. 100%. So Swedish women now, because of the glories of socialism, are not allowed to really go out in miniskirts anymore, and all the things that we used to admire about Swedish women back in the 70s and 60s and 80s and stuff, that's all gone. They're not allowed out there because if they wear a miniskirt, they're asking to be raped by their comrades who are here to make their socialist state work. And they live in fear, and they're going to live in more fear, and they're not wrong to live in fear. So more and more and more of these so-called guest workers come in to keep the socialist game going, and pretty soon it's going to collapse. And everybody knows it. And socialism has done the same thing to the birth rate in France, and the same thing to the birth rate in Spain, and the same thing to the birth rate in Ireland, and the same thing to birth rate in Italy. Socialism isn't working in the places where it works because the populations are declining at a catastrophic rate because of socialism. So there you go. What happens is you can in fact, look, Sweden and France are examples of the fact that you can in fact have a perfectly decent socialism that doesn't require terror or murder. It's just that once you implement it, the clock is ticking and you've got 2 generations. That's all. Period. That's true in every socialist country in the world. It's either a death camp or it's an old age home. So it doesn't work. It can't work. It's not working. People aren't reproducing themselves enough to keep the Ponzi scheme going, so it's not working. And there's one more argument about socialism that needs to be made, and this is a very important argument that nobody ever seems to get. Let's go back to Sweden again. Sweden, the socialism that works. Kind, wonderful, well-educated, decent Sweden where everybody's happy and everybody makes the same amount and everything's wonderful. Sweden can afford socialism because Sweden doesn't have to pay for defense. And neither does France, and neither does Britain, and neither does Ireland, and neither does Germany, and neither does Italy, and neither does Spain. They can afford a large social welfare state and cradle to grave benefits because they don't have to pay for defense. The reason they don't have to pay for defense is because we pay for defense. It's the American taxpayers, those knuckle-dragging Neanderthal capitalists, who have generated the wealth in the form of taxation to provide a military that deters aggression not only around the United States but around Western Europe as well. Their socialism is predicated on our paying their defense bill. And if they had to pay their own defense bill, they wouldn't be able to afford the cradle-to-grave socialism. They can't afford it anyway, but they wouldn't have been able to run the Ponzi scheme this long. Because you may say, you're really missing the point here if you say, oh, well, England could cover its share of its defense. But that's not the point. England or France, hey, we're good, thank you. The question isn't whether England or France or Sweden could, on some level, ditch enough socialism to step up to cover their share, their pro rata share of NATO defense. That's not the point. The point is, if you take America away and our capitalism away and our defense away, and all that defense is driven by the dynamics of the American capitalist economy. In other words, if you take the capitalism out of the world, which is what they want to do, and you take America out of the picture, there is no way on earth that Sweden and France and Germany and England can have a socialist state and enough of a defense to deter themselves, to deter other socialists. The reason you have good socialism in the world in terms of France and Sweden, I don't consider it good socialism, but that's the example they'll use, is because these filthy capitalist Americans are providing the defense forces to protect France and Sweden from whom? We're protecting the good socialists from the bad socialists in Russia and China. Right? Right. You take America and capitalism out of the picture, and now Sweden has to have a defense budget to defend itself against Russia, and it just will not happen. There's not enough people. And why would it defend itself against Russia? Because Russia is bad socialism. They just want power, and they want people to bend a knee. So Sweden and France and all these they're little pockets of stability provided for by this giant capitalist warmongering force across the Atlantic. And without us here, Sweden would have been a Russian province or a German one. Would have been either Soviet socialists or National Socialists, but they'd be speaking German or Russian. And so would France, and so would Holland, so would Belgium, so would England, so would all of them. It's American capitalism that defends good socialism against the bad socialists, and most of them are bad to begin with. And I could put all of this aside, Aloe, honestly. Just put it all aside and say, socialism is bad morally. Even if it worked great, it's morally wrong to take from people who work harder and give it to people who don't. Now, charity for people who can't work is one thing, but taking from the people who work harder and giving it to people who don't is stealing, and stealing is bad. Moving on, Dave Olson says, you Republicans and your war on women have created a rape culture, which would be terrible if it were true, but it's not true. Total rapes have gone down significantly in the last 20 or 30 years. It's just not true. And I really could just leave it right there, and really should just leave it right there. It's not true because it's not true. The reason it's not true is because it's not true. Rapes are down significantly. The war on women, the Republican war on women, really comes down to the fact that conservatives believe that baby girls as well as baby boys have a right to enter this earth. If you look at what most abortions, selective abortions are done for around the planet, the thing that's the one quality that's aborted around the planet by a large margin is femininity. Little girls are killed all around the world, preferentially to little boys. And if you were allowed to do it in America, they've done surveys about this. If you could do it in America, you would be able to abort female fetuses. If you were able to do a sex-based abortion in America, they'd kill the girls. So, first of all, the war on women is nonsense because, number one, most abortions that happen when you talk about Republicans and their war on women, wanting women to have, to live up to this responsibility that they've accepted by having a child, the people that are selectively aborted are girls. It's the Republicans that are trying to stop abortion in general. That's number one. Number two, it's conservatives who believe that it's up to men to protect women from bad men and rapists. And so you might want to ask yourself, as they did in The Sopranos pretty well, I thought, if you're, I've forgotten her name now, the psychologist, the woman, and you're walking down a dark alley, and you have Tony Soprano on one hand, the big masculine, conservative, armed, tough guy, and you have Peter Bogdanovich, the sensitive, caring, feeling fellow psychologist on the other side, who do you think is going to protect you if your life is threatened and it requires an act of courage that may cost the man his life? Liberals don't stop women from being raped. Conservatives, armed conservatives, do. That's what the truth is. And all of these feminists who talk about, they'll say, you'll occasionally hear feminists say certain things like, I'd rather die or be raped than carry a gun, which sounds real good in a parking lot, in a cocktail party in Berkeley or in front of a classroom in Santa Monica. But I'd be willing to bet you that if these feminists were in the process of being raped, they would probably take a different opinion. If somebody's being raped, if a woman is in the process of being beaten, because you have to beat people to rape them, beaten and raped, and you said to them, at this point, would you, as you say, prefer to continue on with this process, or would you like an armed conservative to come in and stop it with his gun? I think you'd see a large shift in their attitude about these things. And like so much of socialism and so much of liberalism, it sounds great at parties because it makes you feel and sound morally superior to other people. But when push comes to shove, I'll bet you every single one of these feminists on planet Earth, when in the process of actually being raped, if they were asked, hey, time out, would you like a conservative with a gun to stop this now, or do you want to continue on with what you said about you'd rather die before you carry a gun, or any of that other stuff? Which one would you rather take? We all know what the answer is. These Code Pink people, I've said before, who are protesting enlistment at the U.S. Marine Corps, that's swell. If you take a vacation down into Cabo San Lucas, let's say Miss Code Pink and the rest of your Code Pink fanatics trying to stop innocent children from enlisting in the death machine. Let's say you're down in Cabo San Lucas on the beach having a wonderful time and just sipping your Chardonnays in a hot tub, and the Zetas come along and capture you for ransom and take you someplace and fire up a chainsaw and cut the heads off of one or two of your friends in order to make the point, and you're on camera on your knees and you're next. Then how do you feel about the U.S. Marine Corps? Because I like the Marine Corps whether I am having my head about to be sawed off, but I also like them when I'm sitting at a cocktail party. See, there's no conflict between my vision about what I think is important. And finally, the thing I'll say about this war on women is just, again, it all comes down basically to the abortion issue. And look, I'm all about not telling other people what to do, and I'm a big part of that. But when you hear women say, it's my body, it's my choice because it's my body, at this point I have to just kind of jump in where my part of my brain that's kind of connected to wanting to speak the truth kind of leaps in and says, but it's not your body. If it were your body, it would be indistinguishable from the rest of your body. But that embryo could have been conceived 10 minutes ago, and that embryo has a genetic code that is not only different than yours, it is irreproducible by you on your own. And if you and the father got together and kept trying, the chance of reproducing that particular cluster of two cells that you're talking about now, or one cell, 2 cells, 4 cells, if you and the man got back together again, your chance of reproducing that exact genetic code is, I think it's 1 in 4 trillion, 1 in 4,000 billion to produce just that one set of 4 cells. You could say to any woman who tries to say to you, this is my body, stop this war on women. Look, I'm ready to have the discussion. I really am, about privacy. I'm more than happy to have the discussion. We're going to have that discussion based on fact, though. This is my body. It's not your body. I could take a sample from your hair, a sample of your blood, a sample of your fingernail, and I can genetically type you, ma'am, and I know exactly who you are. But if I do the same thing to the cells, to that cluster of cells that you talk about, it's an entirely different person. And it's a unique person. And you can't make that person again no matter how hard you try. So it's not your body. It's a body within your body. That's the war on women. Isn't it interesting and sad that according to feminists, progressives, and Democrats, you are not a real woman unless you are 100% in favor of being able to murder your children right up until the moment of birth? That's pretty much where we are right now. The progressive definition of a real woman is somebody who is willing to murder their unborn children right up until the moment of birth. That's the litmus test. Pretty sad litmus test when you get right down to it, isn't it? Pretty inhuman from a fundamental meaning of the word inhuman. It is, in fact, an inhuman quality to select. And if a baby can be aborted anytime prior to birth, because that's what they're saying, because the one thing we can agree on is there are really two milestones here. There's conception and there's birth. There's nothing that happens between those 2 points that's unique. Everything else is a spectrum. Conception is unique. Birth is unique. There's some people say you should be able to abort a baby 10 minutes after birth, 15 minutes after. Some people in Australia were saying 2-3 years, as long as it's not a drain on real people. But from conception to birth, nothing happens from one day that's any different than the next day. Conception is unique. Birth is unique. And if you can abort a baby 10 minutes before birth, why can't you abort one 10 minutes after birth? Is it less of a person then? You know, again, this is a tough issue. I just want to have the discussion based on fact. On fact. I want people talking about actual, physical, truthful facts and not hiding behind these fig leaves. So the war on women is created. It's just created. There's no one in the Republican Party saying women should get paid less for the same amount of work. What we are saying is when you claim that women get paid less than men, statistically, you're incorrect. While women as a body do in fact take home less pay than men, it's not because a man working as a receptionist makes $9 an hour while let's hire the woman. We only have to pay her $8 or $7.50. That only happens in the White House with Michelle Obama or Barack Obama. There's nowhere anywhere in America today, and has been for decades, where a woman is given less money because she's a woman. The reason women make less money than men per capita over the entire population is because they work fewer hours than men, and they work less dangerous jobs than men, and other indications for why men would get overtime or extra pay for the same amount of job, same kind of work. It's just that simple. So like everything else, it just doesn't exist. There is no rape culture. There isn't a rape culture. It's men, conservative men, actual men, who are taught not only not to rape women, they're taught to prevent rapes of women with their firearms. You have to lie about everything in order to be a socialist, Democrat, progressive today. And if you don't have anything to sell. Got time for one or two more. Joshua Lazoya says, why are you so determined about having national sovereignty? Isn't a global government the better way to go? By having global laws and standards, national conflicts will be easier to solve. Countries can help build one another up, and global peace will be easier to achieve. The United Nations, which was launched right at the end of World War II, was designed to bring other nations up to the standard of the West. And what it did was it took the West down to the standards of other nations. What makes anyone think that two countries would have the same goals? See, this is the kind of arrogance of it. This is the kind of intellectual arrogance that the left has. And it's arrogance brought about by stupidity. And it's stupidity brought about by arrogance, which is arrogance that brings about stupidity, and the stupidity brings about more arrogance, and you're trapped in this progressive cycle. And the way it basically works is, why don't we all just get together? If we could just get over our nationalistic differences, we'd all just get along. Why can't we just get along? See how much smarter I am than you ammoed up conservatives with your guns trying to defend this prehistoric idea of America? While we, not being as arrogant as these people, have the intelligence to say, there are things that I like to do, and there are things that people in ISIS like to do. And they're not the same things. For example, in the Middle East, in Iran or Saudi Arabia, I would want everybody to get down on their knees and pray to Mecca 5 or 6 times a day. And if I lived in Saudi Arabia, I would want women to stay indoors because I wouldn't want anyone to see them because I'm terrified of women if I'm a Saudi. And I would want to make sure that everything is set up exactly just for me, and anybody who disagrees cuts my head off. But the main thing is getting down and praying to Allah 5 times a day, no alcohol, no gambling, no premarital sex, no music, no dancing, no kissing in public, nothing. If I'm a Saudi, that's what I want. This argument assumes, see, here's the arrogance of it. This argument assumes that if we could just get down and talk to the Saudis, then the Saudis would suddenly turn into Berkeley hot tub liberals. In other words, well, we just work our problems out. Really? What would that solution look like? Oh, the Saudis would kind of loosen up. And they'd let women in Saudi Arabia do what they want to do. I think that's swell. What makes you think the Saudis would loosen up? And why do the Saudis have to loosen up, by the way? If you're going to solve the problem, what are you going to do? Are you going to get down and pray to Mecca 5 times a day? Are you going to give up alcohol for the rest of your life because you're trying to solve a problem with people who live in Saudi Arabia? What if the deal is, okay, the Saudis agree to drop the veil, but we agree to kill all the homosexuals. How about that? How would that be for a deal, for a compromise? When people talk about these compromises and all of this being a misunderstanding, it's the arrogance of them saying the solution to the misunderstanding is they'll do everything the way we want them to. We won't have to fight them for it. We won't have to go to war. They'll just come along. They'll be Berkeley conservatives. And if they want to be real San Francisco conservatives, maybe their guys can start having sex in the street in leather outfits in broad daylight. But that's the arrogance of it, because they're real people too, you see. And they outnumber us. And what they want is not what we want. I want to be able to say, I think the Prophet Muhammad is a warmongering, pedophile, slave-owning murderer who deserves as much worship as anyone else who's a slave-owning, pedophile, mass murderer. Now, if I said that in another part of the world, I'd be killed. I like being able to say that, and I'll fight for it. I'm not going to give it up. Likewise, they're not going to give up the idea that saying something like that is cause for stoning to death of the person that said it. You see, this whole thing about sovereignty being given up and us living under the auspices of the United Nations is the arrogance of people with small minds and even smaller imaginations, assuming that everybody's going to do things the way they want them to. But it ain't necessarily so. And the only people that they will argue with and fight with, these liberal progressive douchebags, is with people in their own culture. In other words, if you told them that they had to go to church every Sunday, once a week instead of 5-6 times a day, they would take to the streets with torches at the idea of being forced into Christianity and having these beliefs forced on them. By having a display, there's a Santa Claus out in the middle of a square, that's repulsive and repugnant to me, take it down. But somehow the Saudis and ISIS and all these other people are going to change everything they believe to accommodate them? No. We already know how intolerant the left is. They won't let somebody have a frickin' Santa Claus display. They expect that these people who live in Sharia are suddenly going to sit down, have a nice Chardonnay in a hot tub, and talk about their gay lovers. It ain't going to happen. And since it ain't going to happen, you better be prepared to fight them. As I said before, we're not the ones with the coexist problems. They are. But since they do have a coexist problem, and there are no coexist bumper stickers in Iran or in the Crimea with those tanks going into Russia, in that case, I think we're the ones who ought to be ammoed up, because we coexist actually pretty well. There you go. Moving on. I think this will be the last one. We still got a bunch to go. It's a good one to end on. Christopher Dale Goodwin says, progressives care about people. Why don't conservatives? That's a flat-out lie. What do you mean progressives care about people? Progressives claim to care about people. And progressives have policies that have enslaved, God knows, 30, 40 million black Americans, have condemned 3 generations now to a future of dependence, not just of black Americans, of all Americans. Their educational policies have robbed children of any sense of success, any sense of achievement. They've turned them into a gigantic cohort of 2 generations of utterly dependent, inert, weak crybabies for whom the slightest disagreement causes them to burst into tears. And when their parents die, what are these people going to do? Everything the progressives touch gets worse. Everything gets worse. They're the ones who are in favor of limitations on power plants, and they want to destroy dams, and they want to blow up refineries, and they want to build down power plants, but they still live in air-conditioned houses with flat-screen TVs. They're giant hypocrites that have done nothing but make life miserable for everybody. And when their political views are taken to their logical conclusion, it ends up in murder. And large numbers of murders have to be committed to protect the illusion of this paradise that's always just around the corner. It's always just around the corner. When Barack Obama was elected, the progressives in the news media said, oh, look, here's this terrible scandal that implicates the president. It's enough to have him impeached. We can't report that. Why not? Because we all know that Obama's trying to bring about aid to poor people, and he's trying to help blacks, and he's trying to do all these other things. So we can't report the truth or the news because of the greater truth that's just around the corner. Barack Obama and Eric Holder are inventing stories to generate riots. They're inventing data to generate riots. Black unemployment has never been as bad as it has been under Barack Obama. Poor people are the people who get hurt the quickest and the worst in an underperforming economy, and progressive policies produce underperforming economies. And so, just to take a progressive example of how much they care about people, you'll hear progressives say, we should make the minimum wage $15 an hour because we care about people, while conservatives don't. They're too stupid and too lazy to understand that virtually every business that's hiring minimum wage people at $7 or $8 an hour will not be able to afford them at $15, which means that people won't be working for $15 an hour where they used to be working for $8. They won't be working at all. They'll be put out of business. Because if a person flipping a hamburger gets paid $8 an hour and the law says they have to get paid $15 an hour, then all of a sudden that mechanical hamburger flipping machine, which didn't make sense at $7 an hour, now makes a lot of sense. And so not only will those people not get the $15 an hour jobs, they won't have their $7 or $8 an hour jobs either. So the progressive love for the people will hurt people by putting them out of work. And you can see this all across the board in everything they do. Progressivism is rich liberals trying to convince each other that they're smarter and better than other people, and as a result of their cocktail politics, everybody gets hurt, but the poor and the sick and the black and the Hispanic get hurt the worst. Every time. Every time. And if you want to understand the difference between a liberal and a conservative, it's actually very, very, very straightforward. And I'll put evidence for this on the table for the rest of my life. A liberal would rather do something that feels good but causes harm. And a conservative would rather do something that feels bad but causes good. It's that simple. It's just that simple. Conservatives are against government handouts, not because we hate poor people or black people or Hispanic people. It's because we know it condemns them to a life far less than what they could and in fact should be. It's tough love. It's real love, because tough love is real love, isn't it? You claim you love your kids, and yet you let your kids do things that you know is destructive for them, and you allow them to continue because you don't have the courage or the fortitude to stop them. That's not love. Real love is the kind of love that will charge in front of a tiger or a bus or a bullet to protect the person that you claim to love. Real love sacrifices itself and has the courage to give itself up to protect what it loves. So, if you're not even willing to face the consequences of your progressive catastrophes in the name of love for poor people, in other words, if your progressive policies make poor people worse off by every measure, that's not loving poor people. That's loving your image of yourself. as a defender of poor people. Conversely, if I say things like handouts are bad for people and we should stop giving them, that's not me hating poor people. That's me saying you poor people out there who are dependent on these progressives have a life ahead of you that is better than what these clowns have condemned you to. Our vision of what your life should look like is a vision where you are not a piece of dead wood floating down the river of their designs, but rather a motorboat that can move left and right and even upstream and go wherever you damn well want to. That's our vision of what everybody's life should be like. Everybody should be free because free people can write their own books. Free people write their own destinies. Free people are not dependent on other people writing their books for them. And if it turns out that it's a little hard to get you off of this dependency that you can become independent and free, that's actual genuine love for you. That's not just talking about it. As a matter of fact, you know it's real love because we are condemned for it. We're made out to be racists and homophobes and murderers and mean when our policies free you and their policies condemn you, and they give each other tongue baths every day for how wonderful they are and condemn us as being Nazis and evil when all we want is for you to live like actual people just like the rest of us, just to be free, just to have control over your own destiny, because you can't slice us any other way. No matter how many goods the government gives you, and they never give you enough, and they never will. It's by definition. They give you just enough to keep you voting for them. Even if they were giving you Cadillacs instead of bus rides, it still would be bad for you because it doesn't ever give you the chance to see if you like a Porsche better, right? It doesn't give you a chance to see if you like a bicycle better. It doesn't give you a chance to walk out to that Cadillac and instead of saying, oh, look, it's the same crappy Cadillac, instead of walking out there and saying, this is the physical manifestation of the 4 years that I sacrificed and worked. And every time I open the doors to this car, I feel like a king because this is the result of my effort. It's mine, I earned it, and it makes me happy. What else can you say? These progressives hate people. And if you don't think I'm kidding, look at the brass tacks of it. When you compare conservatives to progressives, the brass tacks about who hates people and who's really mean. Which one of these two teams is trying to protect people who have not been born yet? Which one of these two teams values the sanctity of a unique life? And which of these two people have a religious belief in many cases that says that the immortal soul of a 4-year-old girl who is 4 months old in the womb is going to outlast the earth and the universe? It's more valuable than the planet. It's unique. It needs to be saved. Which team is fighting for the lives of people who are in comas? Because we think that, first of all, they may recover, and secondly, they're alive. They didn't say. Which team is fighting these death panels, and which team is fighting a giant state where health care can be terminated by a board review? Which team is fighting for the idea that, you know what, maybe I don't want to get on the cart just yet for the good of the public. Maybe I may be old and decrepit and worn out and broken down, but I don't want to get on the cart yet. You know? Well, society no longer has any use for you. Well, society can go F itself. Okay? That's my granddad, or that's me. I'm not getting on your cart because I'm no longer maximally, optimally effective for the state. Who wants to put healthcare in the hands of people where there's no choice to go someplace else? They do. Who's talking about euthanasia? They are. Who's talking about murdering unborn children? They are. Who are the ones that are constantly talking about eliminating people from the planet because people are a cancer? They are. Who are the ones that want people to live in shacks without air conditioning or heating, eating sustainable algae cakes because of an image they have? They are. They are the ones who are saying all of this, not us. We're saying you should be free. You should be free to work. You should be free of somebody else having the strings over your lives. The harder you work, the more you should be able to do. And if you want to fly around in a jet at 60,000 feet that is owned by you, that takes $2,000 an hour to burn, then by God, man, if that's what you want to do and you want to work yourself hard enough to do it, then that is what being human is all about. It's the essential quality of humanity, is the ability to be happy, is the ability to make yourself happy. You make yourself happy sitting around a campfire eating algae cakes, swell. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not making you fly around in jets in the stratosphere. You don't want to fly around in a jet in the stratosphere? That's fine. You want to sit out back of the 7-Eleven, smoke dope? That's groovy. I don't care. I don't care. None of my business. But these swine have to tell everybody what to do, and again and again and again and again and again. The only reason they talk about these policies is so they can convince each other how smart and how good they are. When the Bolsheviks were being murdered by other Bolsheviks in the basement of the Lubyanka, when these communists were taken underground, stripped naked, put up against a wall to be shot by other communists, more often than not, what they would say would be, "Long live Stalin. Long live Lenin and his glorious revolution." In other words, their religious belief in heaven on earth was so great that they couldn't even condemn the murderers that were about to shoot them in the back of the head. That's how pathetic and weak and desperate and sad these people are. Even when they're being murdered by their own philosophy, they still can't condemn it. I think I said this once before. I'm a Ted Cruz fan, and I'm a Tea Party fan, and I think the Tea Party's awesome. I think Ted Cruz is awesome. But if the Tea Party and Ted Cruz come to power and Ted Cruz becomes president, and Ted Cruz amasses the kind of power that allows him to have me arrested, stripped naked in the basement someplace in the Treasury building, put up a wall and shot, I can assure you that my last words will not be, "Long live Ted Cruz." It'll be a sentence, and there'll be 4 words in the sentence, and 2 of those words will be Ted Cruz, but the other 2 words won't be "Long live Ted Cruz." I can assure you of that. So that's why I believe what I believe, and I don't know why this is so hard. We're taking a while to get through these things, but you know what? I think if we have to do 7 parts on it, let's do 7. We've done 80 episodes. It's not like the general grab bag giving us anything different. I think this will make a neat little set. Who knows? Maybe we'll put them on a disc or something. Wouldn't that be cool? So as it's time for me to go, we now wrap up episode 80, yes 80, yes 80 of the Stratosphere Lounge, the Tough Liberal Questions Edition, part 2. And I'll just put my little mark that I can make because I can write because I'm a free person. I'm not just a peasant, I'm not just a peasant. I don't just collect grains and potatoes for the king. I can make my own mark with my own hand. And we'll make it right there. The big X of identity has gone down. No one else in the world makes an X that looks exactly like that one. And we'll start again next week with part 3 of the tough liberal questions, because you know what, folks? They're not that tough. They're just liberal questions. They're not that tough. They all have an explanation. It's not like I get to the point where I'm broken on the rocks of, "Ooh, they got me on that one." I kind of hope that they do someday, but I suspect they won't, because, yes, Scott Mazinski, I do see the comments, because truth is on our side, and if truth weren't, I'd be on a different side. If healthcare were free, I'd be in favor of free healthcare. If the Loch Ness Monster was an air-breathing plesiosaur, it'd come up for air, right? Anyway, episode 80 brought to you by you. Brought to you by the good people out there who have supported me all these years through comments and lovely, lovely, lovely comments, emails, Facebook messages, the whole thing. Memberships at billwhittle.com are what keep the lights on in this particular building. And if you can possibly afford to be one of those, certainly we would use your money as if it were our own, because it is, and we will treat it with a great deal of respect and go out and try and do some good with it. But anyway, do it or not, that's fine. We're still here for you. And we'll get on the next part of this easy-to-dunk philosophy of lying and failure that just seems so attractive to people of weak minds and weaker egos. Until then, thank you for joining us. Episode 80 comes to a sad conclusion. I don't know if 81 will be in front of the new banner, but given the person I spoke to today who was dying to get in here, who's got a lot of experience with this kind of thing, I'm hoping that certainly 82 will be. Hail Vectron, and we'll see you next week for episode 81. Thanks a lot now. Y'all have a good evening. We'll see you. Bye-bye. Be careful out there.